They thought they could bully their way onto my land until they realized my neighbor was a retired Marine sniper with a perfect view of their every move. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. James Morgan stared at the letter in his hand, the official letterhead of Pinecrest Homeowners Association emblazoned across the top. His property was being fined $5,000 for unapproved landscaping modifications and failure to maintain property standards. The thing was, James didn't live in an HOA community. His 5 acres of land sat well outside city limits, a rural property. He'd purchased specifically to avoid the bureaucracy of suburban living. He crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. 3 days later, another arrived, more threatening in tone. Final notice: failure to comply will result in enforcement action. A phone number was listed at the bottom. When James called, he got a recording instructing him to leave his credit card information to settle the fine immediately. Classic scam, James muttered to himself. His neighbor Ray, a retired Marine sniper who lived a quarter-mile down the road, had mentioned similar letters showing up in his mailbox. They'd laughed it off over beers on James's porch last weekend. But something about the official-looking letterhead and the increasingly aggressive language bothered him. James decided to install trail cameras around his property perimeter. If someone was casing his place for a scam, he wanted evidence. Ray offered to keep an eye out too when James mentioned it during their weekly target practice session. "These scammers are getting bolder," Ray had said, adjusting the scope on his hunting rifle. "They're not just after old folks anymore. They want property too." The black SUV came up James's long gravel driveway at exactly 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. From his kitchen window, James watched 2 men in what appeared to be police-style uniforms step out. Navy blue pants, light blue shirts, and badges that caught the morning sunlight. But something was off. The vehicle had no official markings, just a magnetic sign reading Pinecrest Enforcement Division. James texted Ray, "They're here. 2 guys, fake badges." Ray replied instantly, "On my property line with binoculars. Taking pictures. Don't engage yet." The men approached James's front door with purpose, one carrying what looked like official paperwork, the other with a hand resting casually near his hip where James could see what appeared to be a holstered weapon. James's stomach tightened. These weren't just scammers sending letters. This was something more dangerous. Through the security camera app on his phone, James watched as one of the men knocked loudly on his door. When there was no answer, they exchanged words and began walking the perimeter of his house, taking photos and making notes. One of them tried the handle on his workshop door. "Sheriff's been called," James texted Ray. "Should be here in 15. "I've got eyes on them," Ray replied. "One is armed, not a real service weapon. Closer to a replica. Be careful." James decided it was time to make his presence known before things escalated. He stepped onto his front porch, making sure to stay behind the reinforced porch column. The men immediately turned and approached. "Mr. Morgan?" called the taller of the 2. "We're with Pinecrest Enforcement. You've been ignoring our notices." "This property isn't part of any HOA," James replied calmly. "Never has been. You need to leave." The men exchanged glances. The shorter one stepped forward, hand still hovering near his hip. "Sir, we have documentation showing this parcel was incorporated into Pinecrest community last year. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." James noticed a second vehicle, now pulling up his driveway. His heart rate kicked up until he recognized it as Ray's truck. The officers turned to look as well. "The actual sheriff is on his way," James informed them. "So if I were you, I'd start explaining why you're impersonating law enforcement on private property." The shorter man's face hardened. "We are authorized enforcement officers for the Pinecrest community. Your property is subject to our jurisdiction, and we're here to initiate asset recovery for unpaid fines." "Asset recovery?" James repeated incredulously. You mean theft? Ray's truck stopped about 50 yards away. Through his open window, James could see the glint of a camera lens as Ray documented everything. The men hadn't noticed that yet, focused, as they were on James. "Here's what's going to happen," said the taller fake officer, pulling out papers from his folder. "You're going to sign these transfer documents acknowledging your debt to the HOA, or we're authorized to begin seizure of equipment to cover the fines." James almost laughed. "That's not how any of this works. You have no legal standing here." The shorter man took a step forward. His hand, now clearly resting on what James could see, was indeed a fake police weapon. "We have authorization to use reasonable force to secure HOA property." At that moment, a voice called out from behind them, causing both men to spin around. Ray stood beside his truck, phone clearly recording in one hand. "And I've just photographed your vehicle identification numbers, your faces, and this entire interaction." The men froze, suddenly realizing they were being documented from multiple angles. A tense silence fell over the property, broken only by the distant sound of tires on gravel, the actual sheriff finally arriving. "You gentlemen picked the wrong property," Ray continued calmly, "and the wrong neighborhood. We've been tracking your scam for weeks." The shorter man's hand twitched near his holster, and Ray's voice took on a steely quality James had never heard before. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. Sheriff Peters doesn't take kindly to armed trespassers, and neither do I." Something in Ray's tone made the man slowly move his hand away from the weapon. Sheriff Peters's cruiser came into view, lights flashing but no siren. Behind him, 2 deputy vehicles followed. The fake officers' demeanor changed instantly, their confident postures deflating as they realized the gravity of their situation. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Peters called as he stepped from his vehicle, "I understand there's some confusion about property jurisdiction here." "These men claim to be from something called Pinecrest HOA Enforcement," James explained, stepping down from his porch now that reinforcements had arrived. "They're threatening to seize my property for fake HOA violations." Sheriff Peters nodded. "We've had reports of this operation working its way through 3 counties. Fake HOA notices followed by intimidation tactics, usually targeting properties at the edges of actual HOA communities." The taller fake officer attempted to interject. "There's been a misunderstanding. We represent a legitimate—" "Save it," Peters interrupted. "We've got warrants out for individuals matching your descriptions in Harrison County. Impersonating law enforcement, attempted extortion, fraud. Deputies, please detain these gentlemen while we sort this out." As the deputies moved in to handcuff the scammers, the sheriff turned to Ray. "Mr. Daniels, I assume you've got footage of this entire encounter?" Ray nodded. "From multiple angles. Trail cams caught them trying doors around the property, too." "Excellent," the sheriff replied. "We'll need all of that." 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with the fake HOA enforcers. The early summer evening stretched long across James Morgan's property, painting his 5 acres in gold and amber hues. From his wide front porch, James watched the sun begin its lazy descent behind the tree line, the cold beer in his hand sweating onto the wooden armrest of his Adirondack chair. Beside him, Ray Daniels, his neighbor and unexpected guardian, sat in comfortable silence, his weathered face contemplative as he took a long pull from his own bottle. James still found himself scanning the driveway periodically. A new habit formed, in the aftermath of what locals were now calling the HOA hustle. Sheriff Peters had assured him the threat was neutralized, but experiences like that left invisible marks, a heightened awareness, a lingering unease that settled somewhere between vigilance and paranoia. "You know what gets me?" James finally said, breaking the companionable silence. "How many people must have paid those fake fines out of fear or confusion? For every person like us who questioned it, how many just wrote the check to make the problem go away?" Ray nodded solemnly, the former Marine's eyes narrowing as he gazed out across the property. The setting sun caught the silver in his close-cropped hair, a reminder of the years he'd spent serving before retiring to this quiet corner of the county. "That's why these scams work. People get scared when someone shows up with a badge, real or not. They prey on that fear. Most folks don't know their rights or the limits of authority. They see official-looking paperwork and uniforms, and their critical thinking shuts down. The sheriff said they've identified at least 27 victims across 3 counties, James continued, shaking his head in disbelief. Mostly older folks, people living alone, some who actually did live in legitimate HOAs and couldn't tell the difference between real notices and the fake ones. Those bastards collected over $120,000 before they hit our neighborhood. Ray adjusted himself in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his solid frame. And that's just what they know about so far. Peters told me yesterday they're still getting calls. The investigation's spreading to neighboring states now that they've connected these guys to a larger operation. Apparently, they've been targeting rural properties adjacent to developing communities, betting on the confusion as new HOAs form. The 2 men fell silent again as a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, hunting in the last light of day. James reflected on how differently things might have gone if he hadn't had Ray nearby, if he hadn't installed those cameras, if the sheriff had been delayed just a bit longer. The shorter of the fake officers had been carrying an actual weapon. Tests later revealed it was a real handgun despite the fake badge and uniform. The potential for violence had been very real. Well, they picked the wrong house this time, James finally said, his voice carrying a new resolve. And the wrong neighbor to have watching my back. Ray chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting. 15 years behind a scope in the Marines teaches you to notice details. Those guys weren't cops. Wrong posture, wrong equipment, wrong everything. The moment I laid eyes on them through my binoculars, something felt off. Real law enforcement has a certain way about them, a confidence that comes from actual authority, not pretended power. When that guy's hand kept drifting to his hip, I thought things were about to go sideways, James admitted, feeling a chill despite the warm evening. I've never been so glad to see the sheriff in my life. Peters is a good man, Ray affirmed. 26 years in that department. Knows every property line dispute and neighborhood quarrel for 50 miles. The moment you called him about a Pinecrest HOA trying to claim your land, he knew something wasn't right. James reached for the cooler between them, extracting 2 more beers and handing one to Ray. The bottles hissed as they opened them, a small celebration of continued peace. To vigilant neighbors and real law enforcement, James proposed, raising his bottle. And to property rights, Ray added, clinking his bottle against James's. Some things are worth protecting. The darkness was settling in earnest now, the chorus of cicadas and frogs rising from the surrounding woods. James flicked on the porch lights, casting a warm glow around their little sanctuary. In the distance, the security lights he'd installed after the incident created a perimeter of illumination around his property, not because he feared a return of the scammers, but because the experience had awakened him to the vulnerability of isolated living. I've been thinking a lot about community lately, James said after a while, his voice thoughtful. When I bought this place, what I wanted most was space and privacy, to be left alone. I specifically chose land outside any HOA or city limits, because I didn't want anyone telling me what color to paint my mailbox or how tall my grass could grow. Ray nodded in understanding, his profile sharp against the gathering darkness. Freedom's a powerful draw, but there's more to it than just being free from rules, James continued. What happened showed me there's strength in connection, too. You, Peters, even Mrs. Abernathy down the road who reported seeing the same SUV casing her property. We all came together when it mattered. That's a different kind of freedom. The freedom that comes from security. That's what we fought for overseas, Ray said quietly. Not just abstract principles, but real communities. People watching out for each other. James considered this, watching as the first stars appeared overhead. I'm organizing a neighborhood watch meeting next Thursday at the community center. Peters is going to come talk about recognizing scams, knowing your property rights, that sort of thing. I'd like you to say a few words about what to look for, how to spot people who aren't what they claim to be. Ray raised an eyebrow, surprised. Public speaking isn't exactly my strong suit, James. Neither is being social. But here we are, James replied with a smile. Consider it your civic duty. Besides, Peter said these scammers might be part of a larger network. They've identified similar operations in 5 other states. They might be down, but they're not out. Next time, it might be someone else's property, someone without a former Marine sniper as a neighbor. Ray considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right. For the community. The night had fully descended now, stars pricking the velvet darkness above. The property felt different to James now. Not just a piece of land he owned, but part of something larger, a community with invisible bonds connecting each parcel to the next. The fake HOA enforcers had tried to exploit isolation, counting on fear and confusion to achieve their goals. They hadn't counted on the strength of rural solidarity. Did I tell you about the call I got from the DA yesterday? James asked, setting his empty bottle on the small table between them. Ray shook his head. Turns out our friends with the fake badges were part of an organized group targeting properties across 5 states. The investigation has uncovered links to at least 3 different fraudulent property acquisition schemes. Some targeting the elderly, others focusing on properties in financial distress. They'd create these fictional authorities, HOAs, municipal code enforcement, even environmental, compliance officers, and use intimidation to either extract payment or force property transfers. Sophisticated operation, Ray observed. The DA wants us both to testify when the case goes to trial. Apparently, we're their strongest witnesses since we have the most comprehensive documentation of their methods in action. The camera footage and your photos are key evidence. Ray's expression darkened. I'll testify, but I don't relish the spotlight. None of us do, James agreed. But Peter says our testimony could help put these guys away for a decade or more. It's not just about the money they stole. It's about the fear they created, the violation of people's sense of security in their own homes. The conversation lulled again as both men contemplated the ripple effects of what had happened on James's property that day. The scammers had been after money, but they'd stolen something more precious from their victims. Peace of mind, the belief that home was safe, that authority could be trusted. Restoring that would take more than just legal justice. I've been helping Mrs. Abernathy install security cameras this week, Ray mentioned after a while. And the Hendersons down the road, creating a neighborhood alert system too so we can notify each other if suspicious vehicles are spotted. James smiled, not surprised that the solitary veteran had been quietly strengthening community defenses. That's good. Really good. Different kind of mission, Ray said with a slight shrug. But the objective's the same. Protect what matters. As night fully embraced the countryside, James felt a renewed appreciation for his land, his freedom, and the community that had come together to stop a predatory scheme. The fake HOA enforcers had tried to take what wasn't theirs, not realizing that in this neighborhood, people looked out for each other, sometimes from a distance with a very careful eye. The lesson wasn't lost on James. True security didn't come from isolation but from connection, from knowing that vigilant eyes were watching, that neighbors would stand together against those who would exploit and intimidate. As he sat there in the peaceful darkness beside his friend, he understood that the best defense against predators wasn't just fences and cameras, but the invisible bonds of community, people willing to watch out for one another when threat appeared. On the horizon. Another beer? James offered. One more, Ray agreed. Then I've got to get back. Early start tomorrow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, under the canopy of stars, their little corner of the world was safe, and they intended to keep it that way.